Good morning, everyone. We're on day 2 of our 2-day conference on the topic of surveillance, monitoring, and data gathering for contemporary work. I would like to start off this morning with some remarks by our principal investigator and director of the California Labor Lab, Ed Yelin.
So I've titled the slides for this summary, A World of Worrisome Practices. We had many speakers who described worrisome practices. First, Karen Levy from Cornell described the ways that monitoring of activities may segue into replacing workers, but also that using tech to augment worker capacity may sometimes be beneficial. She described how truckers whom she studied for over a decade have been subject to deregulation for decades, and their pay is only a fraction of what it once was. It actually once was a fairly high-paying occupation. And increased surveillance of their activities is part of a process of stripping them of power. Lisa Kresge from Berkeley reviewed the many ways that workplace monitoring and surveillance are done. I find the work that she's done personally really revealing because she gets inside the black box. And she shows that how we're tracking worker history prior to the point that they're hired and after they're hired. We track their social media presence as a way of screening them. And we find evaluations through things like Yelp and other evaluation sites of their past activities, whether it's relevant to the job or not. For the present, we monitor their work activity, everything from logging in to their computer use, their breaks. We collect cognitive and behavioral data on them, both by observing them, but also by asking them to complete forms. And we monitor them through biometric testing, sometimes that they must agree to, and sometimes that's done even surreptitiously. And we survey their health indicators. Christopher Nye from Michigan State gave a talk on AI and hiring and recruitment, and he described many problems in using AI. The most important outcome of the problems is that it may not achieve goals of getting the right people hired for the right jobs. He described how AI can produce bias scores and raises significant privacy issues. But beyond that bias, there's bias in which applicants have access to the tech. So it may not identify the best candidates because some of them don't use the tech or don't have ready access to it to get hired in the first place. But he also said a lot of the issues that apply to AI also apply to traditional hiring. So it's not a problem that's limited to hiring through AI. Kristen Harknett and Daniel Snyder started off by reviewing troubling trends in employment, including the risk shifting from the firm to the worker, polarization in the labor force, the decline of manufacturing, and the decline in unionization. They talked about how increasingly business is run 24/7 and how labor is part of just-in-time inventory, the way that getting parts to an assembly line are. And then they closed by showing startling high reported prevalence of surveillance in the service sector, numbers 2 or 3 times what many of us expected to see. Our last 2 speakers are both qualitative researchers. Tracy Vargas from the University of North Carolina, Pembroke, uses dollar stores and Exemplar. She was a participant observer there as an employee when she was in graduate school to examine the duality of employers, of workers as both employees and suspects, in effect, part of what she refers to as a carceral system. She described the double whammy of low pay in the job and work overload they're having trouble hiring people because they pay so poorly. And that redounds to the people, unfortunately, who remain workers there. But she also pointed out that major sectors of an economy have an incentive for the continuation of mass poverty. They're in the business of exploiting people who are poor. Finally, Julia Tacona from Penn made distinction between gig work and defined it in a very helpful way, I thought, and platform-based employment, which is just a tiny fraction of all employment. Platform work is not that prevalent, in some estimates as small as 1% to 2%, but gig work or work in non-traditional hiring, as she defined it, may be as much as 10 to 40% of workers. She also described the phenomenon of what she called digital kin keeping, as low-wage workers have to monitor their kids or elders while they're working, and sometimes are fired for trying to do that. She showed the impact on the caregiving economy of requiring workers to have Social Security numbers, as has increasingly become the case after the start of the pandemic. But she closed by explaining some of the pressure points on the road to regulation reform through the state, consumer web, and other means. So she was a nice segue to today, where we're going to talk about ways of making work more helpful. So here you see before us the speakers for today. I'll be followed by Kathleen Mosier from Teamscape and San Francisco State University. And before you see the agenda for the day. After she talks, Bob Harrison from our center, UCSF, and State Department of Public Health will talk about surveillance. Lee Newman from the University of Colorado will talk about a program they've developed to monitor the occupational health of former workers as well as current ones. After the break, Tasha Joshua from IKEA will talk about the implementation of safety wearables within retail co-worker populations. And then Stefana Chavan from Berkeley, architecture professional, will talk about healthy buildings, thermal comfort monitoring. You'll have lunch, after which Juanita Negron will talk on the little tech coming for workers, documenting, investigating, and building worker voice and power to overcome some of the troubling things we heard about yesterday. And finally, we'll close with a policy discussion led by Laura Stock, who's our Director of Community Engagement, and Victor Rubin, who's our Director of Policy Affairs, and including Mitch Steiger, Tim Shaddix, Ellen Reese, Julianne Allison, and Matthew Shera. You'll hear more about where they're from later. And then we'll have closing comments from Chris Banks. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Chris for her expert moderating of our conference.